Okay, in section 9.3, we're going to look at the graphs of trig functions. So we're going to start off with our basic sine and cosine graph. So let's start off with cosine. So we're going to have y is equal to cosine x. And we're going to get the values off of the unit circle, but you can't think of these as x and y. They don't correspond to the x and y over here. It actually, x is your input, that's your theta or your s, and then y is your output for your cosine value. So remember that all of our points are cosine sine. Okay, and then the angles going around are going to be your input, your x values. Okay, so looking at the cosine graph, what I'm looking at is when we graph, we typically graph in radians. So I am looking at these values going around the circle as my x values. These are my input values. Okay, I'm gonna erase these in a second so we can actually read them. But that's what I'm going around looking at my x values as. Okay, those are my inputs. And then my outputs are going to be the cosine values, which is the first coordinate of each of these. Okay, so that's what I'm looking at, is I'm looking at the radian value as my input, and then the cosine value, the first part of the coordinate, as my output. All right, so let's clean that up. So when I go to graph it over here, I'm looking at, for the first one, 0, 1. So again, I'm looking here and here. My input is 0, my output is 1, so that gives me the point 0, 1. Let's call this 1 and this 2, just to give ourselves a little bit more room. Okay. All right, so I'm going to start at, my input is 0, my output is 1, so 0, 1. And then I'm going to have to figure out how to space all of these, so that's kind of the tricky part. I know that I'm going to go all the way around to 2 pi. So this is 0, 2 pi. So let's go ahead and write this out as, let's do that as 2 pi. Okay, so whatever increment you're going to make, you have to be able to divvy up the graph depending on what that increment is. So if I want to go 0 to 2 pi, I can make it anywhere that I want, but I need to try to hit these marks. So I chose an even number, 2, 4, 6, 8. So that's going to put me halfway. 2, 3, 4. Okay, that puts me here halfway at pi. Halfway between 0 and pi would be pi over 2. And then halfway between pi and 2 pi would be 3 pi over 2. Okay, so I'm just taking these values and breaking them up evenly on the graph. There's no real right or wrong here. So if you had done these, it just spaced 1 apart or 3 apart, as long as they're evenly spaced, because they're equally apart. All right, so we're starting at, let me go ahead and graph this in red. We're starting at 0, 1. That's my first value here. Okay, and then I'm going to kind of jump over these right now. My next is going to be pi over 2, 0. Okay, so pi over 2, I know is at 0. Actually, let me erase that. Okay, pi over 2, 0. Okay, so those are like my first two key points. Now, between 1 and 0, I'm going to take on all of these values. So I think this is about 0.9, 0.6-ish, and then 1/2 would be 0.5. All right, so these, see how they're kind of spaced the way that they're actually spread out on the graph as well. So they're not evenly spaced, but the idea would be that I start at 1, I go to about 0.9, 0.6, 0.5, down to 0. Okay, so you could graph these exactly if you wanted to, but it would be like 0.9, 0.6, 0.5, and then 0. So what happens is you kind of get this kind of rounded shape like that. I can't go above 1 though. All right, so there we go. Well, I'm just making that worse, aren't I? There we go. Okay, so that's the first part. And then the second part is going to go from pi over 2 to pi, and I'm going to go from 0 to -1. So from pi over 2 to pi, I'm already at 0, and I'm going to go down to -1 at pi. Okay, and then again, I take on all of these values right here. So -1/2, -0.6, -0.9, or so, something close to that. Why won't, I'm not sure why that's not erasing now. There we go. Okay, so again, we're going to kind of come down like this. Okay, so it's not a straight line, it curves a little bit. There. And then hopefully you can kind of see the pattern going here. So the next group would be -1 to 0. And again, I'm going to run through all of those values again. So I'm at -1, I'm going to go to 0. And I'm going to run through all of those values again. That's going to give me another round part. Okay. And then going back to 2 pi, I'm going to have 0 to 1. And I'm going to go through all of those values again. Okay, so you kind of end up with this U-shaped thing. They're like a bowl maybe with sides to the bowl. So that's our basic cosine graph. Our basic cosine graph. So that runs from 0 to 2 pi. That's called the period. That's where we see one full picture. Would be 0 to 2 pi. Remember we talked about the domain is actually all reals. We're just doing one piece of it. This is one period. And then remember the range went from -1 to +1. So we can see that here on the graph. The lowest value is -1, the highest value is +1. So the range is -1 to +1. Now, if we wanted to fill out, so this is one period, this is one lap around the unit circle. If we wanted to fill out more, it would just keep repeating. So coming back from 0, we'd be traveling negative around the unit circle. So we'd go from 1 to 0 now going backwards, and we would run through these same values. Okay, or you can just repeat. It's going to reflect what's on the other side here. So we would go back to 0 like that, and then we would keep repeating this pattern. So this would be -pi, -pi over 2, -pi, -3 pi over 2, and I can almost make it to -2 pi. Let's pretend it's there. Okay, so I just keep repeating this. So that's going to come back down to 0, and then we can see here it's going to repeat this bump here. So that's going to come down to 1. It's going to come back up to 3/2, and then repeating this, it's going to come up to 1 again here. Okay, and then if we had more of a graph here, we could keep going with our S shape that way. All right, so anything outside of this 0 to 2 pi range is just going to keep repeating. So period means that you have one complete picture with no repeats, and then anything outside of that is going to keep repeating. Okay, so that's the basic cosine graph. It starts at 1, it goes all the way through and comes back up to 1 at 2 pi. All right, so let's do sine. So sine is pretty similar. Just cover that up. Oh, I lost the... That's weird. When I was moving it around, I kind of lost the axes. Let's just leave it like that. Well, I'm not going to be able to fit that on. Okay, there we go. I lost the X and Y axis when I was moving it around. Okay, so the next one that we're going to do is sine. And if cosine made sense, then sine should as well. Sorry, my pen is hopping around a lot tonight here. Sine x. So for sine, we're looking at the second coordinate now, and the same thing, that the angles are all of our inputs. So I'm doing the angle to the second coordinate, angle to the second coordinate, and so on, angle to the second coordinate. So very similar to the cosine idea, but a new graph. So let's mark this out the same. So here's 1, here's 2. Here's -1, here's -2. All right, so we're going to start at 0, 0 this time. So sine starts off at 0, 0. Let's mark this as well. Pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, 2 pi. We can just barely squeak that on there. Okay, so we start at 0, 0. Oh, I was doing red before, wasn't I? And then we're going to run through all of these values just like we did before. And at pi over 2, we're going to be at 1. So at pi over 2, we're going to be at 1. And we run through the same values that we did with the cosine graph. So we get that same kind of bend to it, like that. And then the next part, we go from 0 to -1. Oh, I'm on the wrong one, sorry. We go from 1 to 0. We're on the sine one now. I go from 1 to 0. So I'm starting at 1. I come down to 0. And then I go from 0 to -1. And then I go from -1 to 0. Okay, so same idea as the cosine graph, but a little bit different of a picture. We end up with this S-shaped graph. Okay, and again, that's one period. So we go 0 to 2 pi gives us one complete picture. And if we wanted to repeat, we would just follow that pattern all the way back. So it would come back down to -1, 0, +1, 0. Okay, so if we keep drawing, it's going to be a repeat of that. Okay, and that's the basic sine graph. So basic sine graph starts at 0, ends at 0, and hits 0 halfway between. Kind of looks like an S.